If you've ever debated a Christian apologist claiming that Jesus was the Messiah and the Son of God, you've probably encountered a claim like this.
The Old Testament, written over a 1,000-year period, contains nearly 300 references to the coming Messiah, and all of these were fulfilled in Jesus Christ.
During Jesus' lifetime, he fulfilled more than 300 prophecies.
And he fulfilled them literally down to the smallest detail.
After careful examination of the first coming prophecies of Messiah, it is undeniably clear that Jesus of Nazareth fulfilled them all.
All the intricate details of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, all of those details were foretold by prophets centuries before Jesus was born.
Things like he'd ride in Jerusalem on a donkey, he'd be betrayed by a friend, he'd be born in Bethlehem, he'd be called out of Egypt, he would be sold for 30 pieces of silver, he'd be crucified. And you know Jesus fulfilled all 300 of those predictions?
How could one man fulfill all of these prophecies unless he was the Son of God who was predestined to?
One easy response to these claims could be to say, well, Jesus didn't exist at all. He was a fictional character, so of course he fulfilled prophecies because the gospel writers made up his biography using the Old Testament. Some scholars, like Dr. Richard Carrier, have made compelling arguments that Jesus of Nazareth did not exist as a historical figure. If that's true, then the whole Christian argument from fulfilled prophecy goes out the window. However, most scholars, including atheist scholars like Bart Ehrman and those outside of New Testament studies, Francesca Stavrakopoulou, agree that there was a historical Jesus of Nazareth, but regard the stories about him performing miracles and raising from the dead to be myths.
No, Jesus, most scholars would agree that he existed, yeah.
If we assume Jesus did exist, do the details of his life, his place of birth, his childhood, his baptism, his ministry, his arrest, and his crucifixion, do any of these actually fulfill Old Testament prophecies? That is the question we will be diving into today.
You shall come forth for me.
This was done to make the scripture come true.
For he promises to send the
Whose
Messiah.
coming forth is from old, from ancient days.
He hath borne our griefs, carried our sorrows.
And shall call his name.
The scripture that says, people will look at him whom
and
they pierced.
rejected of men.
Hey, real quick, I want to give a special shout out to the Queen of MythVision, my partner, Ryan Lambert. She actually runs the MVP courses side, where we have academics who've been featuring on MythVision for many years now. They're teaching courses and walking students through their specialty and some of the stuff they've learned along the way to help you at the convenience of your own home or wherever you may go. You own the course for life, but educating people, bringing this knowledge to the public. You're helping the academic out, you're helping MythVision, you're helping the Queen, and you're helping yourself with taking your education further. So this is a little shout out. We have courses with Dr. James D. Tabor, we have Robin Faith Walsh, Dennis McDonald, Joshua Bowen, Kip Davis. I mean, the list goes on and on. We have several academics. I hope you'll go and check it out. If you get a chance, sign up for one of them. You own them for life again, and you're helping us keep this machine going. So thank you so much to everybody who's helped contribute. I hope that you'll go there and help the Queen out, help yourself out, and let's keep this public insight, public information going forward. Thank you so much. Many Christians claim Jesus fulfilled 300 or more prophecies from the Old Testament. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through all 300 of these, because if we spent 2 minutes on each and every one, this would be a 10-hour video. Instead, we're just going to focus on the prophecies that Christian apologists find most compelling and normally bring up in debates. Usually the lists of prophecies Christians come up with start with a whole bunch of predictions about the Messiah's ancestry. For example, they say the Old Testament writers predicted the Messiah would be a descendant of Abraham, and a descendant of Isaac, and a descendant of Jacob, and of the tribe of Judah, and of the line of David. Then they count these as 5 distinct prophecies about Jesus' ancestry and lineage. This is pretty silly and a little dishonest if you think about it. Being a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, etc. just means the Messiah was supposed to be a Jew. Is it really that surprising that the Jewish Messiah predicted by the Jewish prophets was supposed to be Jewish? Not only that, but if Jesus was a descendant of David, then by definition, he would also be from the tribe of Judah, since David was from the tribe of Judah. And if he was from the tribe of Judah, then by definition, he would also be a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So these 5 prophecies are actually just one prophecy that the Messiah would be a descendant of David. This isn't even bringing in critical scholarship who thinks that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob probably never existed to begin with. Davidic Ancestry. There is no question that the Old Testament predicts the Messiah would be a descendant of David. But did Jesus really fulfill this prophecy? The Gospels of Matthew and Luke base their claim of Jesus' Davidic ancestry on 2 lists of genealogies provided at the beginning of their Gospels. However, both lists completely contradict each other, making it doubtful that either one is true. In his book, The Birth of the Messiah, Raymond E. Brown explains where the genealogical lists in Matthew and Luke probably came from. Matthew's list of names for the post-exilic period is too short to cover the span of time, and neither his names nor those of Luke's longer list coincide with the descendants of Zerubbabel listed in the Old Testament. Even if there were official genealogies of the royal house of David in the post-exilic period, there is nothing to support the thesis that Matthew drew upon one. It is far more plausible to assume that, at most, he may echo a popular genealogy of the royal lineage that circulated in Greek-speaking Jewish circles as part of their speculations about the coming of the Messiah. Such a popular tradition would have been subject to changes, losses, inaccuracies, and vagaries of the imagination. What one may say with surety of Luke's list is that, in part, it is artificially arranged in numerical patterns of 7, and that it contains enough inaccuracies and confusions to suggest a popular provenance, rather than an archival provenance, among Greek-speaking Jews. While the 2 New Testament genealogies tell us how to evaluate Jesus, they tell us nothing certain about his grandparents or his great-grandparents. Since there is no sound historical basis for accepting Jesus' royal lineage as factual, the Christian claim that Jesus fulfilled the requirement for the Messiah to be a descendant of David is probably Christian propaganda, as M. David Litwa writes. Tracing Jesus' line through King David was a bolder claim. Historically speaking, however, Matthew's claim is as little justified as Aeneas being the descendant of King Dardanus, or Julius Caesar being the descendant of King Ancus Marcius. Jesus' Davidic ancestry is a mythic claim with a culturally specific meaning for Jews and proselytes, except the rightful king. In the Gospel of Matthew, we get several claims that Jesus fulfilled 5 Old Testament prophecies by his birth and childhood alone. Matthew 1:23 states that Jesus being born of a virgin fulfilled Isaiah 7:14. Matthew 2:6 states that Jesus being born in Bethlehem fulfills Micah 5:2. Matthew 2:15 claims that Jesus being brought to Egypt fulfills Hosea 11:1. And Matthew 2:18 claims Herod's massacre of children fulfills Jeremiah 31:15. In Matthew 2:23 it says, Jesus being raised in Nazareth is also a fulfillment of prophecy. But he doesn't say which prophet predicted this, and he doesn't quote any passage from the Old Testament. Most Christians assume Matthew is referring to Isaiah 11:1, but that verse also doesn't mention Nazareth or say the Messiah will be a Nazarene. All it says is that the Messiah will be a branch from the stump of Jesse, and the Hebrew word for branch is netzer, which sounds a little bit like Nazareth. Needless to say, claiming this is a prediction of the Messiah's hometown is quite a stretch. Now, let's go through the rest of these Old Testament passages, see if any of them actually make the predictions that Matthew claims they make. First of all, Isaiah 7:14 says,
Behold, a virgin shall bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel.
At first glance, there's a big problem with this prophecy. The claim that Jesus' mother got miraculously impregnated by the Holy Spirit while she was a virgin cannot be proven historically. In fact, you pretty much have to already be a Christian to accept that Jesus was really born of a virgin. Another problem is that this verse in Isaiah 7 has been mistranslated in most modern English Bibles. The Hebrew word Isaiah uses to describe the woman who will conceive is Alma, and that word just means young woman, not virgin. The word that means virgin in Hebrew is Bethulah. In fact, the famous Christian apologist Michael L. Brown and James White admit that the wording of Isaiah 7:14 does not support the Christian interpretation of the virgin birth.
Now, does Alma in itself mean virgin? No. Can it? Yeah. But does it in itself mean virgin? No. It has to do with youthfulness, not virginity. So it could well be a virgin, but in and of itself, it doesn't mean virgin.
Even atheists are aware of the fact that the Hebrew term Alma does not technically mean virgin. Alma in the Hebrew language can simply mean a young woman of marriageable age. What you don't need to be doing as a Christian is attempting to argue against the lexical meaning of Alma.
Moreover, Isaiah 7:14 clearly states that the child born would be called Emmanuel, not Jesus or Yeshua. The context of the verse makes it absolutely clear that it could not be referring to Jesus, because this child named Emmanuel was supposed to be a sign for King Ahaz that God would protect the kingdom of Judah during the Syro-Ephraimite War in the 8th century BCE. The next prophecy, Micah 5:2, does appear to claim the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. The verse reads, "But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days." The claim that Jesus was born in Bethlehem doesn't seem as far-fetched as the claim that he was born of a virgin. However, many secular scholars doubt that the traditions about Jesus' birth are historically reliable. Only Matthew and Luke actually claim that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and both writers invent wildly implausible and contradictory narratives to explain how he was born in Bethlehem, but raised in Nazareth. The author of Matthew has Jesus' family start off in Bethlehem and then end up in Nazareth to escape a massacre of children by King Herod. The author of Luke has Jesus' family start off in Nazareth and then take a trip to Bethlehem to register for a census. Both versions of the nativity story are incompatible with each other, so it's unlikely that either one is historically accurate. As the renowned biblical scholar E.P. Sanders said, "It is not possible for both these stories to be accurate. It is improbable that either is. They agree only on the two sets of facts. In real history, Jesus was from Nazareth. In salvation history, he must have been born in Bethlehem. Del Martin, another biblical scholar from Yale University, stated, Jesus was a lower-class Jewish peasant from Nazareth, a small village in Galilee. There is no reason to believe the later legends that he was born in Bethlehem. Finally, Bart Ehrman, a New Testament scholar from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, writes, we also have good reasons for doubting that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Not only is the tradition rooted in the belief that the Messiah was to come from the city of David, but the two accounts of how it came about hopelessly contradict each other. The next prophecy claim from Matthew's infancy narrative is that Jesus' family fulfilled Hosea 11:1 by leaving Bethlehem to go to Egypt, and then leaving Egypt to settle in Nazareth. Matthew writes, this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. If we look at the original verse in Hosea 11, we can see that it is obviously not talking about the Messiah. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. Not only does the text specifically state that the son is Israel, it even talks about how this son turned from God and sacrificed to pagan idols after being called out of Egypt. If this text really is about Jesus, then Jesus was a sinner who committed idolatry. Holy smokes. Obviously, Hosea 11:1 is not about the Messiah. It's about the people of Israel being led out of Egypt by Moses, and then straying from God by sacrificing to idols like the golden calf. The exact same cherry-picking and omission of context happens with Matthew's citation of Jeremiah 31:15. The verse reads,
in Ramah was there a voice heard, lamentation, weeping, and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children, and would not be comforted because they were no more.
Matthew claims this is a prophecy about Herod's order that all the male children in Bethlehem, 2 years old or younger, should be slaughtered. However, if we just read the next two verses, it's clear what this lamentation and bitter weeping is really about. Keep your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for there is a reward for your work, declares the Lord, and they shall come back from the land of the enemy. There is hope for your future, declares the Lord, and your children shall come back to their own country. Notice how it says, they shall come back from the land of the enemy, and your children shall come back to their own country. Obviously, this is referring to the Babylonian exile. The book of Jeremiah was written between 627 and 586 BCE, during which there were several deportations of Jews by the Babylonians. Rachel, the wife of the patriarch Jacob, is not weeping for toddlers murdered in Bethlehem in 4 BCE. She is weeping for the thousands of Jews who were taken into captivity after the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem. That's why the text expresses hope that they will one day return. Jeremiah famously prophesied that the exile would last 70 years, and then that Jewish captives would be allowed to return to the land of Israel. Jewish babies murdered in Bethlehem obviously couldn't come back to their own country. Furthermore, virtually all New Testament scholars agree that Matthew's account of King Herod massacring infants and toddlers in Bethlehem is fictional, since that event isn't attested in any extra-biblical sources, including Josephus. As the biblical scholar Maurice Casey writes, Herod was cruel, But he was not so foolish as to launch such a pointless attack on his own people. And the absence of this atrocity from Luke and from Jewish sources must mean that it did not occur. Virtually all biblical scholars share this skepticism. For example, E.P. Sanders writes, Herod was ruthless, and he did kill people who seemed to pose a threat to his reign. Did he slaughter all male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or younger? It is not likely. Josephus narrated a lot of stories about Herod, dwelling on his brutality, but not this one. Finally, as we already saw, the claim in Matthew 2:23 that the prophets predicted the Messiah would be called a Nazarene is completely false. No Old Testament passage states that the Messiah would be from Nazareth. In fact, the town of Nazareth is never mentioned in the Old Testament. Forerunner. Moving on to the main narrative about Jesus' adult life, the Gospels claim that John the Baptist fulfilled the role of the Messiah's forerunner prophesied in Malachi. The verses read, Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight. Behold, he is coming. Behold, I will send you Elijah, the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children, and the hearts of children to their fathers. Most scholars and historians agree that John the Baptist existed as a historical figure, since he is mentioned by Josephus. They even accept that Jesus probably was baptized by John in the Jordan River. However, Malachi does not say just any random apocalyptic preacher will be the Messiah's forerunner. He predicts that Elijah himself will fulfill this role. Why? Because according to 2 Kings 2:11, Elijah was taken directly to heaven by chariots of fire and a whirlwind. Like the pre-Diluvian figure Enoch, Elijah never died. That's why some Jews like Malachi expected him to return prior to the Messianic age. John the Baptist clearly wasn't Elijah. He didn't drop out of the sky. He was born into a priestly family. His parents were Zechariah and Elizabeth, and according to the Gospel of Luke, he was Jesus' cousin. Not only that, many scholars consider it doubtful that John the Baptist actually regarded himself as the Messiah's forerunner, or that he viewed his ministry as a preparation for Jesus' ministry. In the Jewish annotated New Testament, David B. Levinson writes, The Gospels show John subordinating himself to Jesus. Historically, this is unlikely, given that John baptized Jesus, and that John's followers remained loyal to him after Jesus appeared on the scene. Had John thought Jesus to be the Messiah, he would not have retained his own disciples. The connection of John to Elijah also suggests that John was not, historically, Jesus' forerunner. In the Tanakh, Elijah's role is to prepare Israel for the great and terrible day of the Lord, not to announce another agent of God. It may not even be the case that John the Baptist expected the Messiah at all. As John P. Meyer writes, we do not know whether John the Baptist ever acknowledged Jesus as a special figure. John the Baptist may not have anticipated any further agent in the eschatological drama except God himself. Christian apologists normally claim that John the Baptist came in the spirit and power of Elijah, based on Luke 1:17. But this, of course, is a theological claim that cannot be verified historically. Parables. Another alleged prophecy Christian apologists normally bring up is that the Messiah would teach using parables. Matthew 13:35 claims that Jesus using parables was predicted by Psalm 78 verse 2, which reads, I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old. Once again, this is a clear example of cherry-picking and ignoring the context. The full passage in Psalm 78 reads, I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known, that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord, and his might, and the wonders that he has done. In context, this psalm is telling the Israelites to pass on the traditions about God's glorious deeds and wonders to their children. It has nothing to do with fictional stories told to convey moral wisdom, which Jesus was known for. The word in this verse that is translated as parable is mashal, which, according to John S. K. Selman and Michael L. Barr, does not just mean parable. Hebrew masal has a wider range of meanings than parable. Here it means wise instruction. Triumphal entry. Next, Zechariah 9:9 is a prophecy about a king presenting himself to the people of Jerusalem, aka Zion, riding on a donkey. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion! Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem! Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Obviously, there isn't anything particularly remarkable about riding a donkey into Jerusalem. Donkeys were a popular mode of transportation for people 2,000 years ago, so there were probably millions of people who entered Jerusalem this way. Usually, Christian apologists specify that this is a prediction that the Messiah would enter Jerusalem as a king, which of course refers to how the Gospels portray Jesus being welcomed by crowds of people shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David! Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord! And, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel! However, there is a big problem with this big dramatic entry. If Jesus entered Jerusalem with crowds of people hailing him as their king, this would have appeared to the Romans like a political rebellion was about to start, and they definitely would have interrupted the celebration with some violent crowd control. E.P. Sanders writes, if there was actually a large crowd, we must explain how it is that Jesus lived for another week. A public demonstration accompanied by shouts of king or even kingdom would have been highly inflammatory. Passover was a prime time for troublemakers to incite the crowd, and both the high priest and the Roman prefect were alert to the danger. Bart Ehrman also expresses doubt that this event is historical. Even though this account is multiply attested, it is very difficult to accept it as historically accurate. The day before Passover were a tense and potentially dangerous time in the view of the Roman authorities. If Jesus actually entered the city with such fanfare, crowds shouting their support for him as their new ruler, the king who fulfills the prophecies, it's nearly impossible to understand why he wasn't arrested and taken out of the way immediately. It's not hard to believe that Jesus entered Jerusalem riding a donkey, unless he was actually greeted loudly and publicly by crowds of people hailing him as their new king. People knew this kind of behavior would have been seen as treasonous. So why would they do it in the capital city, which was crawling with Roman soldiers waiting to strike in case something like that should happen? Betrayal for 30 pieces of silver. The next alleged prophecy, which is probably one of the top 5 or at least top 10 passages Christian apologists bring up, is another verse from Zechariah, one that supposedly predicts that the Messiah would be betrayed for exactly 30 pieces of silver, and that this blood money would be thrown into the temple, and that the money would then be used to purchase a potter's field. This is a very popular passage because it seems so incredibly specific, and there's no possible way it could be fulfilled by chance. There are, it turns out, mountains of issues with this prophecy claim. To start off, let's look at how the passage is quoted in Matthew 27:9 through 10, then compare that with the actual verse from Zechariah. According to Matthew 27, the verse reads, "And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him on whom a price had been set by some of the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me." Now let's look at how Zechariah 11:12 through 13 actually reads. "And they weighed out as my wages 30 pieces of silver. Then the Lord said to me, Throw it to the treasury, the lordly price at which I was priced by them. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord, to the treasury." Matthew changes almost every single word in this passage. He changes the lordly price at which I was priced by them to the price of him on whom a price had been set by some of the sons of Israel. And he changes "I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord" to "they gave them for the potter's field." As Robert J. Miller writes, the prophecy quoted in Matthew 27:9 through 10 is neither copied nor paraphrased from any biblical text. It is Matthew's own construction, most of it based loosely on Zechariah 11:13. However, the central action described in the prophecy and the deed that Matthew narrates as its fulfillment, the purchase of a field from a potter, is not found in Zechariah, and not anywhere else in the Old Testament. Some Bibles actually have Zechariah say potter rather than treasury, but this is actually a mistranslation, as Robert J. Miller also explains. Most modern English Bibles deviate, with good reason, from the Hebrew text of Zechariah 11:13 and read treasury rather than potter, relying on the wording in the ancient Syriac and Aramaic translations of this verse. The two words are almost identical in Hebrew. The potter is heyatsur, and the treasury is hayatsur. The Aramaic and the Syriac version were apparently translated from the original wording treasury, which was later miscopied as potter into the standard Hebrew. Since potter makes no sense in the sentence, and since treasury fits the context, this is one case where the standard Hebrew text is clearly mistaken. So in Matthew, the 30 pieces of silver are thrown into the temple, then given to the potter. But in Zechariah, the 30 pieces of silver are simply put into the temple treasury. The details clearly do not line up as Christians claim. Zechariah 11 also does not say the 30 pieces of silver will be used to betray the Messiah. If you actually read the context, the pieces of silver are the wages paid to the prophet Zechariah by 3 shepherds for tending a flock of sheep for a month. It is not blood money paid to the Messiah's betrayer. There is no mention of the Messiah anywhere in Zechariah 11. There is one more problem with this alleged prediction of Jesus' betrayal. Even if the passage in Zechariah 11 was a real prophecy and said exactly what Christian apologists claim it said, there's still the question of whether the details about Judas's betrayal of Jesus are historically accurate. 30 pieces of silver would have only been a few months' wages. Many biblical scholars find it very unlikely that Judas would have betrayed a man he had devoted 3 years of his life to for such a small amount. As William Klassen states, the paltry sum for which he allegedly betrays Jesus is hardly an adequate motive to account for the action. It's also hard to imagine how exactly Matthew could have come by the information about what Judas did with the money and how it was used to purchase a field. The public had no way of knowing how the chief priest had spent the money that Judas had flung back to them. Only Matthew tells of this, and he describes it as a decision reached in a closed meeting. If what Matthew narrates really happened, only a few insiders would have known about it. If one wonders how Matthew could have known about this, the answer is that Matthew, like all the evangelists, tells his story from the perspective of an omniscient narrator, who by definition knows everything and so can inform readers of things an actual narrator would have no way of knowing. So this alleged prophecy fails in multiple ways. First, the verse in Zechariah 11:12-13 does not say what Christians claim it says, and Matthew has to completely change the wording in order to make it fit his narrative. Second, the context of the verse shows that it's not a prophecy. It has nothing to do with betrayal or blood money. It says nothing about a potter or a potter's field, and it says nothing about the Messiah. Third, it's unlikely that Judas was paid such a small amount to betray Jesus, or that any of the disciples of Jesus could have acquired such specific information about the blood money. The most popular Old Testament passages Christian apologists claim are prophecies of Jesus are those that are interpreted as descriptions of his suffering and death. I am, of course, referring to Psalm 22, Daniel 9, Zechariah 12, and Isaiah 53. The first one, Psalm 22, is a poem of lament in which the poet cries to God because of his terrible suffering. The poem contains a lot of generic and somewhat contradictory descriptions of the psalmist's situation. Some verses describe him in a desolate place, being attacked by wild animals, but others describe lots of people around mocking him. His enemies roar and bite him like dogs and lions, but they also steal his clothing like highway bandits. His affliction sounds a lot like illness in some verses, but in others, it seems like he's being violently attacked. Christian apologists assert that the entire poem is a perfect description of Jesus' suffering on the cross, but it really isn't. Some verses do sound like they are describing crucifixion, but not all of them. For example, look at verse 2. I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Here, the poet is describing insomnia, possibly because of some chronic pain or illness. According to the Gospels, Jesus' suffering only lasted half a day. He wasn't experiencing sleepless nights as described in Psalm 22. In verse 17, the psalmist says, I can count all my bones, indicating that he is so malnourished that his ribs are visible. According to the Gospels, Jesus ate a meal with his disciples the night before his execution, so there's no way he was emaciated like this verse describes. As much as this psalm may appear to resemble Jesus' situation, there's another biblical figure it resembles even more: the famous righteous sufferer, Job. If we look at how the book of Job describes the main character's suffering, the resemblance to Psalm 22 is remarkable. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. He has made me a byword of the peoples, and I am one before whom men spit. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. Surely there are mockers about me, and my eye dwells on their provocation. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within my breast. And now my soul is poured out within me. Days of affliction have taken hold of me. The night racks my bones, and the pain that gnaws me takes no rest. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. My bones stick to my skin and to my flesh, and I have escaped by the skin of my teeth. Since Job was obviously not being crucified, it is clear that the descriptions in both Job and in Psalm 22 can apply to a variety of situations, not just crucifixion. Christian apologists, however, point to one particular verse that they think settles the case, that Psalm 22 is about Jesus' death. "For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet." What these apologists don't usually mention is that there is a lot of uncertainty about how the verb in the second half of the verse should be translated. Psalms 22:16 is actually a corrupted text. The word ka'aru, which is translated by Christians as "they pierced," does not exist in the Hebrew language. So scholars have been trying to figure out what the original word might have been. The word kara is supported by the Septuagint rendering araxan, but this word means to cut or to dig, not to pierce. So if kara was the original word, then the verse should read, "They dig into my hands and my feet." "They dug through my hands and my feet," or "they hacked off my hands and my feet." In the Vulgate, the first Latin translation of the Bible, Jerome originally used the word foderunt, meaning "they have dug." But in his second translation, he used vixerunt, meaning "they have bound." The 2nd century translations by Aquila of Sinope and Symmachus also favored words meaning to bind. Other scholars have proposed the translations "they have picked clean my hands and my feet," based on the verb ara, and "my hands and my feet have shriveled," based on the hypothetical verb kari. In the 10th century Masoretic text, the Hebrew word is ka'ari, which means "like a lion." But most scholars don't think this option is plausible because the text is very late, and because the word ka'ari would make the verse "like a lion my hands and my feet," with no verb. Of all these possible translations, "they pierced my hands and my feet" is the least likely, since kara does not actually mean pierce anywhere it is used in the entire Hebrew Bible. Therefore, we have no good reason to regard Psalm 22 as a clear description of crucifixion. Another big problem with taking Psalm 22 as a literal prediction of Jesus' death is the extremely diverse and conflicting descriptions of the psalmist's situation. If this poem is about Jesus being crucified by Roman soldiers, then why does the psalmist talk about bulls, lions, and dogs attacking him? Jesus obviously wasn't attacked by any wild animals at Golgotha. As Christians see it, those predictions are just poetic metaphors. But if the parts about vicious animals are metaphorical, then how do we know the parts about hands and feet being pierced and clothing being divided aren't also metaphorical? For all we know, the psalmist could have meant for the animals to be literal, and for the pierced hands and feet and stolen clothing to be metaphorical, or the entire poem is metaphorical, and none of it was meant to describe a real situation. In the end, there is no indication in Psalm 22 that the suffering figure is the Messiah, and the poem never claims to predict any future events. It is just a poem that uses a lot of vivid imagery and metaphors to depict feelings of misery and hopelessness. So taking any of the descriptions literally completely misses the point. Before we get into the other major prophecies related to Jesus' death, Daniel 9, Zechariah 12, and Isaiah 53, there's another verse in a different part of Psalms which Christian apologists claim predicted a minor aspect of Jesus' crucifixion. In Psalm 69, another poem of lament, the speaker complains about his enemies hating him without a cause, attacking him with lies, and seeking to destroy him. These are also verses that Christians see as predicting the conspiracy against Jesus by the Jewish leaders. But none of these are interesting or compelling enough for us to debunk. Obviously, Jesus was not the only person who had enemies falsely accuse him and plot his downfall. The only verse in the psalm that is worth looking at is verse 21, which reads, "They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me sour wine to drink." According to the Gospels, Jesus was offered 2 drinks during his execution: wine mixed with myrrh prior to his crucifixion, and a sort of watered-down wine vinegar while he was on the cross. Neither of these really fulfills Psalm 69:21. The psalmist describes his enemies giving him vinegar to insult or harm him in the same way they tried to poison his food. Neither drink the soldiers offered Jesus was harmful. The wine mixed with myrrh was actually a high-quality drink that also functioned as a mild anesthetic. The wine vinegar was a cheap beverage that soldiers normally drank. Jesus refused the first drink, the myrrh-infused wine, but only because he didn't want anything to ease his suffering, not because there was something wrong with the drink itself. The second drink was given to Jesus to quench his thirst. The original Hebrew of Psalms 69:21 uses the word rush to describe the food the psalmist's enemies give him. The word almost always means poison or venom. In one verse, it refers to a poisonous herb, probably hemlock. However, in 2 verses from Lamentations, it simply means bitterness. The Septuagint renders rush with the Greek word koli, which is usually translated gall, and often refers to any kind of bitter herb, including wormwood and myrrh. The Gospel of Matthew, which puts the most effort into making these drinks fulfill Psalm 69:21, takes advantage of the Septuagint wording by replacing the wine mixed with myrrh in Mark 15:23 with wine mixed with gall, using the ambiguous Septuagint word that can include bitter herbs like myrrh. Basically, "They gave me poison for food" turned into "they gave me gall for food," which then turned into "they put myrrh in my drink." The myrrh wine and sour wine Jesus received from the soldiers did not fulfill Psalm 69:21. It fulfilled a very loose exegesis of a mistranslation of Psalm 69:21. 70 weeks timeline, Daniel 9. The 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel 9 is another Old Testament passage that Christian apologists regard as an impressive prediction of Jesus. As Christians see it, Daniel presents an incredible timeline of history stretching from the restoration of Israel in the 5th century BCE all the way down to the 1st century CE, when Jesus was executed. In fact, many apologists claim that Daniel supernaturally predicted the exact year of Jesus' death. However, these apologists can't seem to agree which year Daniel's timeline begins.
This prophecy is going to start with a going out of an order to rebuild Jerusalem. Now, when was there an order that was sent out to rebuild Jerusalem? Well, many people believe, self-included, that this is talking about when Artaxerxes, the king, told Nehemiah to go rebuild Jerusalem, and this happened on March the 5th, 444 BC.
From the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince. Here he gives the starting point of the prophecy. And we know the Persian dates very accurately, and this was 458 BC. And this, I believe, is the starting point.
Is the starting point of Daniel's timeline in 444 BCE? Or is it in 458 BCE? Christian apologists differ from each other, which shows that there's a lot more uncertainty in the interpretation of Daniel 9 than Christians admit. In this case, we don't even need to debunk either of these interpretations. We could simply let the Christian apologist debunk each other.
Others would say, yeah, but there was a decree of Artaxerxes, it was like 445 BC, and if you look at a prophetic year, like a prophetic year is 360 days versus 365 days, and we can prove that. And if you'll do that and then compute from 445, it gets you right up to the time of the crucifixion of Yeshua. The problem is it's a bit of an obscure decree to say that was the decree to start it, and then the 360 days, the prophetic calendar, and so on. It's somewhat debatable.
This particular edict we read about in Ezra chapter 7 was given in 458 BC. Clearly, in the way these verses read, permission was there to rebuild the temple, but they were not giving permission to rebuild the walls. They were not given permission to turn the city back to a fortress city. In 458 BC, the timeline does not yet start.
Most scholars who are not Christian apologists believe that the starting point of Daniel's 70 weeks is actually the divine oracle of Jeremiah, which took effect in 586 BCE, when Jerusalem was destroyed. As Richard A. Henshaw states, 70 weeks, meaning 7 times 70, equaling 490 years, the elapsed time since the destruction of Jerusalem, 587 BCE, mentioned in verse 2. Martin Namara agrees. The first week and the entire period commences with the going forth of the word, that is the utterance of the divine decree or divine communication through Jeremiah on the return from exile and the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Frederick J. Murphy explains, Gabriel starts the reckoning of the 70 weeks by saying there were 7 weeks, 49 years, from the time when there was a decree to rebuild Jerusalem until an anointed prince would come. The decree to rebuild Jerusalem cannot be that of Cyrus, because the temple was rebuilt just 18 years later. The most likely time is 586 BCE, when the destruction took place. This interpretation is even supported by Lewis F. Hartman. The first section, the first 7 weeks of years, 49 years, is said to last from the utterance of Jeremiah's prophecy to the coming of an anointed leader. The first part of the 490-year period almost certainly refers to the time that ended with the return of the first exiles from Babylonia to Jerusalem in 538 BC. This would put the end of the timeline in the 2nd century BCE, 100 years before Jesus was born. In order to understand Daniel 9, we have to look at the historical context in which it was written. Virtually all scholars agree that the book of Daniel was completed around 164 BCE. This was a very important year because it was when the Antiochene crisis ended. For those who don't know, the Antiochene crisis was one of the worst events in Jewish history. It occurred during the reign of a brutal Seleucid tyrant, Antiochus IV, also called Antiochus Epiphanes, who basically wanted to eradicate the Jewish religion and replace it with the Greek religion. The crisis started in 171 BCE, when the Jewish high priest Onias III was murdered by his brother Menelaus, who was allied with the Seleucids. The conflict between the Jewish conservatives and the Hellenizers escalated until, in 168 BCE, Antiochus Epiphanes banned Judaism completely, outlawed the ritual burnt offerings, and even defiled the Jerusalem temple by setting up a shrine to Zeus and sacrificing a pig on it. This led to the famous Maccabean revolt, in which a group of Jews led by Simon Maccabeus successfully drove out the Seleucids and restored the Jerusalem temple. This great victory in 164 BCE is the event that is commemorated annually to this day as the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. The 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel 9:24 through 27 fits the Antiochene crisis perfectly. Verse 24 says that the conclusion of the 70 weeks will finish the transgression, specifically the transgression of Antiochus and the Hellenizers. It will put an end to sin. The atrocities committed against the Jewish people and against the temple will be stopped, and the Seleucids would be expelled from the land. The verse also says it will atone for iniquity and bring in everlasting righteousness, because the author of Daniel thought that after the defeat of Antiochus, the end times and judgment day would arrive. The last part of the verse, in verse 24, to anoint a most holy place, is a clear reference to the rededication of the Jerusalem temple. and Christian apologists have no good explanation for how the anointing of a most holy place fits into their Christological interpretation. The anointed one cut off in verse 26 is obviously Onias III. The people of the prince who is to come are the Seleucids under Antiochus, who destroyed the city and the sanctuary by torturing and murdering countless Jews and by desecrating the temple. Verse 27 states that the prince who is to come, Antiochus, shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, referring to Jewish Hellenists like Jason and Menelaus, allying with the Seleucids against their fellow Jews. The next part, for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering, clearly refers to Antiochus outlawing Jewish sacrifices from 168 to 164 BCE, about 4 years or half a week. There is no other event in Jewish history where the temple sacrifices were temporarily stopped for a few years and then brought back. This never happened under the Persians, the Greeks, or the Romans. This verse can only be referring to the Antiochene crisis and the Maccabean revolt. Christian apologists have no explanations for most of these descriptions. They have no clue who the prince who is to come refers to. Some say it's a Roman emperor like Nero, Titus, or Vespasian, and others say it's the Antichrist. They have no explanations for the strong covenant with many for 1 week, or the end to sacrifice and offering for half a week. All they're sure of is that the anointed one cut off must be Jesus. They also try to claim the destruction of the city and the sanctuary in verse 26 refers to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 CE. However, this doesn't work because it's supposed to happen within 7 years after the anointed one is cut off, and the destruction of Jerusalem happened 40 years after Jesus' death. It also doesn't explain why the end to sacrifice and offering only lasts half a week, when the destruction of the temple by the Romans put an end to sacrifice permanently. And remember, verse 24 mentioned that the 70 weeks would end with the anointing of a most holy place, which means the sanctuary which was defiled will be restored and rededicated. This cannot refer to the events of 70 CE, so it cannot refer to the time of Jesus. Pierced figure. The next verse, Zechariah 12:10, describes an unnamed figure who was pierced by the inhabitants of Jerusalem.
And there is another scripture that says, people will look at him whom they pierced.
There are a variety of different identifications of this mysterious pierced figure in Zechariah 12:10. Some regard him as a great military leader who will be killed in a future eschatological war. Others regard him as a prophet or religious reformer killed during some intra-community strife in the Second Temple period. Christians, of course, claim that this figure is Jesus Christ, but there is no evidence either for or against this assertion. John J. Collins sums up the overall scholarly opinion nicely. The one whom they have pierced has been identified with a range of historical figures from Josiah to Simon Maccabee. More probably it refers to some incident that is no longer known to us, near the time of composition. Inevitably, it has also been interpreted in a messianic sense, so some scholars find in this passage a martyrdom of the eschatological Good Shepherd, or Davidic king. There is nothing in the text, however, to confirm that the one who was pierced was a king, since there is no parallel for such a notion of messianic martyrdom in Second Temple Judaism. It seems unwise to derive it from such a cryptic and controversial text as Zechariah 12, verse 10. The Suffering Servant, Isaiah 53. The last and most well-known passage that Christians claim is about Jesus is the fourth servant song, Isaiah 52, verse 13, to Isaiah 53 verse 12, which describes the affliction and exaltation of the mysterious suffering servant. The precise identity of this figure has been debated for centuries. Some claim it refers to the nation of Israel during the Babylonian captivity. Others say it is a righteous remnant or pious minority of Jews during the exile. Still, others say it's about an individual, either a Jewish king like Hezekiah or Jehoiakim, or a prophet like Jeremiah, or the author of 2nd Isaiah himself. There is no concrete scholarly consensus on who the suffering servant originally was meant to be. As John J. Collins states, there is no consensus on the identity of the servant in the original context of Deutero-Isaiah. The most popular views are that the servant represents an ideal Israel, or the prophet himself, or the Israelite king in exile. Benjamin D. Summer agrees, the identity of the servant has generated much debate. Most rabbinic commentators and some modern scholars argue that Deutero-Isaiah speaks here in the first person, and that these verses describe the prophet's own mission. Others argue that the whole nation Israel is the servant, and some suggest that an ideal Israel or a faithful subset of the nation is the servant. Christian apologists feel extremely confident that the suffering servant is Jesus. But if you really break down and dissect the passage, it becomes clear that the descriptions of the servant that sound most like Jesus are theological claims that are not historically verifiable. For instance, lines like, "He has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. With his wounds we are healed. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all, and he will make many to be accounted righteous." Are all religious doctrines about the spiritual significance of this figure's suffering that could be applied to other figures, not just Jesus? For instance, ancient Jewish rabbinic literature identifies the servant with a range of figures, including Moses, Phinehas, Jeremiah, and Rabbi Akiva. The Apostle Paul, who wrote decades before any of the gospel writers, actually identifies himself as the suffering servant. "For I will not venture to speak of anything except that Christ has accomplished through me to bring the Gentiles to obedience. And thus I make it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, lest I build on someone else's foundation, but as it is written, those who have never been told of him will see, and those who have never heard will understand." The typical Jewish interpretation of Isaiah 53 is that it refers to the nation of Israel during the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BCE. This identification is supported by many other verses in the chapters preceding Isaiah 53, which explicitly call the servant Israel. According to this interpretation, the Jewish people bore the sins of the Gentile nations through their persecution and exile, and they brought healing to these Gentiles by showing them who the one true God is. In the book of Daniel, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar and the Persian king Darius come to believe in the God of Israel because of the unshakable faith of Daniel and his companions. Like the suffering servant, these righteous Jews remain faithful and obedient to God, even when threatened with death. If we ignore the theological claims about vicarious atonement in Isaiah 53 and focus just on the historically verifiable descriptions of the servant, there really isn't anything in that passage which points exclusively to Jesus. All it clearly states is that the servant has had a humble origin, was despised and persecuted, was punished with the guilty even though he was innocent, was cut off out of the land of the living, and was rewarded with a long life and children. All these descriptions could apply to hundreds of Jewish individuals from the exile, or to the entire group of righteous Jews personified as a servant. If we had to pick one biblical figure who best fits the description of the suffering servant, a good choice would probably be Jeremiah. who suffered tremendous persecution throughout his life. Jeremiah had a humble beginning, giving up his priestly heritage to become a prophet. He was despised and rejected by his own people, repeatedly beaten and imprisoned over at least 20 years of his career, and he was thrown into a well and left for dead. Yet, his life was prolonged when someone pulled him out and eventually ended up in Egypt, where he lived out the rest of his life and was buried among wicked pagans. The suffering servant of Isaiah 53 could easily be Jeremiah, or a prophet very similar to Jeremiah, or all the righteous Jews during exile, including Jeremiah, Daniel, King Jehoiakim, and many others. Professional scholars who specialize in the book of Isaiah do not agree on who the exact identity of the suffering servant was meant to be by the author of the poem, whether a specific historical figure or a group of righteous Jews. However, they all agree on who this figure is not. He is not the Messiah. For instance, Christopher R. North's classic work, The Suffering Servant in Deutero-Isaiah, an historical and critical study, analyzes and evaluates all the interpretations of Isaiah 53, both ancient and modern, over the past 2,000 years. North concludes at the end, "For my part, I do not think that anything is to be gained by attempts to prove that the servant is the Davidic Messiah of Isaiah 9 and 11. Though there are undoubtedly kingly features in the servant, there's nothing in the songs to indicate that he was to be an anointed king." In more recent work on Isaiah 40 through 55, John L. McKenzie goes further in his assessment by explaining in greater detail why Isaiah 53 is not messianic. In fact, the servant exhibits no clearly royal trait, and the antithesis between the servant and Cyrus pointed out above is equally valid when the servant is compared with the Messiah. No royal trait can be ascribed to him except the proclamation of judgment and law in 42, 1 through 4. And these terms more obviously have another meaning here. The servant is not the same figure as the Messiah, but a parallel figure which, as it stands, cannot be reconciled with the messianic king. A higher synthesis of the two figures, such as Christians believe was fulfilled in Jesus Christ, was not within the vision of the prophets of the Old Testament. Even though Christians assert that Jesus fits the description of the suffering servant perfectly, this is not exactly true. For instance, the servant is portrayed as suffering pain and grief throughout his whole life, not just during his death. Isaiah 53:3 calls him a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. This does not match the Gospel's portrayal of Jesus as an enormously successful and popular teacher who only suffers at the end of his life. Verses 10 through 12 also describes how the servant will be rewarded for his obedience. He shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong. In other words, the servant will be rewarded with a long life, children, and material wealth. Clearly, none of this applies to Jesus, who never married or had any children, was killed at the age of 33, and was homeless and dirt poor all the way to the grave. Even if Christian beliefs about Jesus are true, this last part of Isaiah 53 does not fit him. According to Christian theology, Jesus sacrificed himself not for any reward, but out of pure love for humanity. We can also look at the first 3 servant songs in the earlier chapters of Isaiah and see that the servant's mission takes place during the exile in the 6th century BCE. Isaiah 49:6 says, "The servant's mission is to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to bring back the preserved of Israel." This only makes sense in the historical context where the Jews were scattered among the Gentile nations. Isaiah 49:7 calls this figure the servant of rulers. Jesus was never a servant of rulers. Obviously, this is referring to Jews like Daniel and King Jehoiakim, who served in the courts of Babylonian and Persian kings during the exile. When defending the messianic interpretation of Isaiah 53 against Jewish or secular identifications of the suffering servant as Israel, as the righteous remnant, as Deutero-Isaiah, etc., Christian apologists almost always bring up the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziel, a 1st century Jewish text which is basically a paraphrase of Isaiah 53. These apologists claim that this is the oldest Jewish interpretation of Isaiah 53, and that it supports the identification of the servant as the Messiah. Therefore, the messianic interpretation is the earliest attested interpretation, and the Jewish and secular interpretations are later reinterpretations that should be dismissed. Let's briefly look at the Targum and compare this text with Isaiah 53. The first verse in the suffering servant passage reads, "Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up, and shall be exalted." The Targum of Jonathan paraphrases it as, "Behold, my servant Messiah shall prosper. He shall be high and increase and be exceedingly strong, as the house of Israel looked to him during many days." This seems like a pretty straightforward interpretation until you read a little further. Isaiah 52:14. "As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind." The Targum paraphrases that as, "Because their countenance was darkened among the peoples, and their complexion beyond the sons of men." Clearly there is more going on here than a simple messianic interpretation. The Targum has identified the figure whose appearance was marred as a collective, not an individual. Let's keep reading. "Then he will be despised and will cut off the glory of all the kingdoms. They will be prostrate and mourning, like a man of pains and like one destined for sickness. And as though the presence of the Shekinah had been withdrawn from us, they will be despised and esteemed not." The one suffering here is not the Messiah, but all the kingdoms who despised the Messiah. The Targum has completely changed Isaiah 53 so that the servant no longer suffers, but actually causes his enemies, the Gentiles, to suffer for opposing him. Even the well-known and often quoted line, "He has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted," is changed to, "Then for our sins he will pray, and our iniquities will for his sake be forgiven, although we were accounted stricken, smitten from before the Lord, and afflicted." The vicarious suffering for the sins of others is completely gone. So the Targum of Jonathan is not nearly as big of a checkmate as apologists think it is. In fact, we actually have a trump card of our own that's even bigger. Despite what apologists typically claim, it turns out that this Targum is not the oldest Jewish interpretation of Isaiah 53. There is an older text called the Wisdom of Solomon, which was composed at least half a century earlier than the Targum of Jonathan. In the 2nd and 3rd chapters of this book, the author describes the suffering of righteous Jews at the hands of the wicked who despise them for their righteousness and piety. Wisdom of Solomon 2:20. "Let us test him with insult and torture, so that we may find out how reasonable he is, and make trial for his forbearance. Let us condemn him to a shameful death, for according to what he says, he will be protected. In the eyes of the foolish they seem to have died, and their departure was thought to be a disaster, and their going from us to be their destruction, but they are at peace. For though in the sight of others they were punished, their hope is full of immortality. Having been disciplined a little, they will receive great good, because God tested them and found them worthy of himself. Like gold in the furnace he tried them, and like a sacrificial burnt offering he accepted them. In the time of their visitation they will shine forth and will run like sparks through the stubble." The connection between Wisdom 2-3 and Isaiah 53 is widely acknowledged by biblical scholars. Christopher R. North writes that the writer of the Wisdom of Solomon was familiar with Isaiah 40-66 needs no proof, and his description of the sufferings of the righteous man in verses 1 through 7 reads like a paraphrase of Isaiah 52 and Isaiah 53. Joseph Blenkinsop agrees. We are probably justified in picking up echoes of the last servant's song in this account, especially since the righteous sufferer calls himself the servant of the Lord. David Winston writes, the description of the suffering and vindication of the child of the Lord in verse 13 is based on the fourth servant's song in Isaiah. Addison G. Wright says, the picture of the just here and in 3:1 through 9 is based on the fourth servant's song. This is not, however, our trump card. There is one more Jewish text even older than Wisdom of Solomon, which contains the actual oldest interpretation of Isaiah 53 in existence. This text is none other than the book of Daniel itself. Most people don't know this, but there's actually an allusion to Isaiah 53 in the last chapter of Daniel. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. In the original Hebrew, the word for those who are wise is maskalim. These are the heroes of the book of Daniel, the faithful Jews who were persecuted during their exile but remained faithful to God. In Daniel 12:3, the author describes the glorious vindication of these maskalim by taking words directly from the suffering servant passage in Isaiah. In Isaiah 52:13, the servant is described as yaskil, wise, the root word for maskalim. In Isaiah 53:11, it says the servant will make many to be accounted righteous, and these exact words are mirrored in Daniel 12:3. In 1953, Harold Louis Ginsburg wrote, undoubtedly, our author has identified the meaning of Isaiah 52 verse 13 through 53 verse 12 with the masses in the time of the Antiochian religious persecution, and the servant with the minority of steadfast anti-Hellenizers. This conclusion is supported by John J. Collins, who states, H.L. Ginsburg has shown that the heroes of the book, the maskalim, wise teachers, are modeled on the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. Richard J. Clifford states, Daniel 11:33 through 12:10 has been called the earliest interpretation of the fourth servant song. It interprets the Jewish loyalists of the Antiochian period in the 2nd century BCE as the servant of 52:13 through 53:12. Michael A. Knibb also mentions the application of the fourth servant song to the group described in Daniel 12:3 as the wise and as those who led many to righteousness through the allusion of Isaiah 53:11 and Isaiah 52:12. Let me say this again. The author of the book of Daniel, who Christian apologists believe was inspired by God, agrees with the collective interpretation of Isaiah 53. For Daniel, the suffering servant is not the Messiah, but the righteous Jews who remained steadfast in spite of persecution. So, Christians, who is the suffering servant? It's not the Messiah. It's not Jesus. It's the Jewish people who remained faithful to God, according to the divinely inspired prophet Daniel himself. This is the correct interpretation of Isaiah 53. Checkmate. Case closed. Mic drop. If you disagree with this interpretation, you're disagreeing with the prophet Daniel, who you believe was inspired by God. That concludes our video today. All of the best, most compelling, most popular Old Testament passages that Christian apologists point to as miraculous predictions of Jesus turn out to be nothing but false claims, mistranslations, and really bad exegesis. The Jewish people are right for rejecting Jesus as the Messiah. Jesus did not fulfill even a single messianic prophecy from the Old Testament. If you enjoyed this documentary on prophecies, please like, comment, share this thing far and wide, get people's attention, and I'd love to see reactions from some of the apologists. I'm fairly certain they'll have much to say. But I want to thank Stephen Ford for writing this script and helping craft this video. If you haven't already, consider joining our family by becoming a YouTube member of MythVision on YouTube, as well as joining the Patreon. You can also help the academics that we interview all the time by taking one of their courses. You can literally become one of their students online by taking a course that is a high-quality video series you will own for life. Please take your learning to the next level. Please leave your favorite part in this video. I'll be paying attention. And if you want to hear us cover more prophecies that haven't been discussed in this video, we'll be happy to try and examine those for a future video, depending on the interaction we receive from this one. We love you. Thank you for being here, and never forget, we are MythVision.